A man climbed out of a crevasse and died anyway. He was found frozen about 100 yards from the open crack, on a glacier below Denali, North America's highest peak, 20,310 feet, sitting at 63 degrees north, closer to the Arctic Circle than the Himalaya. The easy answer is cold. Cold is a symptom. The mechanism is pressure. The air up there runs near 360 millimeters of mercury, over half the sea level oxygen gone. So a 20,000-foot mountain behaves like a 23,000-foot one. 1932, 1967, 1992, 2011. Every machine that made this peak reachable moved the dying somewhere new. Start with the number on the map, because the number is the lie. 20,310 feet puts Denali well below Everest, below K2, below dozens of Himalayan and Karakoram summits. On paper, it is a second-tier mountain. In the lungs, it is not. Air pressure does not care what the map says. It cares how much atmosphere is stacked above you, and the atmosphere is not stacked evenly around the planet. It bulges at the warm equator and sags toward the cold poles. Denali sits at 63 degrees north. The column of air above it is shorter than the column above a peak of identical height in Nepal. Then cold compresses that column further, because cold air is heavier, and heavy air sinks, and every millibar of it that sinks below your boots is a millibar that is no longer available to your blood. So the mountain performs above its height. Barometric pressure on that summit sits around 360 millimeters of mercury, and the physiological effect is closer to what a climber meets near 23,000 feet in the Himalaya. It also shifts with the season. The same summit, on a bitter, high-pressure day in early May, presents a thinner atmosphere than it does in the softer air of late July. Nothing about the rock has changed. What has changed is how much oxygen is available to the person standing on it, and that difference is invisible, uninstrumented for most climbers, and entirely unforgiving. Now come down off the summit and look at what that does to a body on a rope. Hypoxia does not usually kill people outright at these altitudes. It does something worse. It degrades judgment first, the thing you would need in order to notice that your judgment is degrading. It slows movement, so a traverse that should take 90 minutes takes 4 hours. It flattens the drive to eat and drink, so a climber dehydrates while surrounded by frozen water. And every hour that hypoxia adds to a day is an hour spent in air that can sit at 40 or 50 below. The cold responds by shutting down peripheral circulation to protect the core, which is exactly the correct decision for the heart and exactly the wrong one for fingers, toes, and nose. That is frostbite. Not an accident, but the body's own triage. Push the hypoxia harder and fluid begins leaking into the lungs or swelling the brain. And a climber who was merely slow becomes a climber who cannot walk and cannot be reasoned with, at an altitude where nobody can carry them. That chain is not theory. A study of medical events on Denali covering 1992 through 2011 found that 71% of all patient encounters happened in one place, the 14,200-foot camp. Frostbite was the single most common diagnosis at just over 18%. Altitude illness was the most common category of illness at 29%. Most of those people, 84 Jiao Sonski was 84%, were patched up and sent walking downhill under their own power. 11% needed to be flown out. 4% needed rangers to physically get them down. Notice what that means. The busiest medical station on the highest mountain in North America is not near the top. It sits less than 3/4 of the way up, which is where the mountain has already finished sorting people. Zoom out from that tent, though, because altitude alone does not explain Denali either. The mountain sits in the middle of a narrow arc of peaks several hundred miles long, standing directly across the path of moisture streaming off the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. There is nothing upwind to soften it, no plateau, no second range absorbing the first punch. Denali rises abruptly from lowlands only a couple of thousand feet above sea level, so it presents something like 18,000 feet of relief to the weather in one uninterrupted wall. The Park Service describes what happens next with an image hard to improve on. The mountain rises so high and so suddenly that it generates its own weather, the way a boulder submerged in a river creates rapids. The extreme winds have two main sources. One is the polar jet stream tracking directly over the summit, a river of upper atmosphere wind that normally lives far above human beings, dragged down across a piece of rock standing in it. The other is cyclogenesis over the Bering Sea and the Gulf, storms that can deepen tens of millibars in a day and then slam into a wall of ice with nothing between them and it. They do not arrive gradually, which raises an obvious question. If this place has always been like this, how did anyone get up it before anyone understood barometric pressure, hypoxia, or the jet stream? The answer is that the people who lived there did not try, and had excellent reasons. The Koyukon Athabascan people named it Denali, the high one, the tall one. That name is thousands of years older than any expedition. Koyukon oral tradition ties the mountain to Raven, the creator figure of that country's stories, and Koyukon geography treated the peak the way a navigator treats a lighthouse. Athabascan naming practice, in sharp contrast to the European habit that later stuck an Ohio politician's name on it, does not name places after people at all. Land is not a monument. Land is information. And the information said stay low. Subsistence life in that country ran through the lowlands and the foothills, the rivers, the caribou routes, the fish camps. On a seasonal round that moved when the resources moved, the high glaciers offered nothing. No food, no fuel, no shelter, no route to anywhere anyone needed to be. What the mountain offered instead was forecasting. From the flats, you can watch the summit build its own cloud, watch the plume tear sideways off the ridges, and know what is coming down onto the lowlands hours before it arrives. Read that way? Denali was never an objective. It was an instrument. Everything that happened afterward is the story of people who wanted to be on the instrument instead of reading it, and who arrived with a schedule. The first party to actually stand on the summit did it in 1913, and they did it the slow way. Hudson Stuck, an Episcopal archdeacon, put the expedition together. Harry Karstens ran the mountaineering, Robert Tatum came along, and Walter Harper, 21 years old, Koyukon Athabascan and Irish, was the first human being to set foot on the top. They walked in. Dogs, sleds, weeks of relaying loads up the Muldrow Glacier and along a knife-edged ridge that Karstens found shattered by an earthquake and had to chop a staircase through. That approach is now remembered as an inconvenience. It was the opposite. Weeks of hauling loads at increasing altitude is, physiologically, a textbook acclimatization program, one that nobody had designed because nobody yet knew it was necessary. They also left an instrument behind, and the instrument is the reason we can argue about how cold that place gets. On the way up, they cached a minimum registering thermometer at Parker Pass at roughly 15,000 feet, the kind of device that records the lowest temperature it ever experiences and holds it. 19 years later, in 1932, a different expedition found it and carried it out. It was graduated only to 95 below zero Fahrenheit. The mark sat below the bottom of the scale. Harry Leake took it to Washington, where the Weather Bureau tested the instrument and found it accurate. And the estimated reading came out near 100 below. That number has never been accepted as an official record, and it should not be. Nobody can now establish how the instrument was exposed across 19 unattended years on a pass. Treat it as a disputed artifact that everyone who has been up there quietly believes. So hold two facts side by side. The first people to climb Denali survived by walking. The first people to die on Denali arrived by air. In January 1932, an engineer at Bell Telephone Laboratories named Alan Carpe won funding for something that had nothing to do with mountaineering. Arthur Compton, the physicist at the University of Chicago, was running a worldwide survey of cosmic rays, and he needed measurements taken near the North Magnetic Pole and as high in the atmosphere as anyone could physically get an instrument. Cosmic ray intensity increases with altitude and varies with magnetic latitude. Alaska was, in Compton's assessment, an important location in the global plan. Carpe happened to be both a serious climber and an electrical researcher, which made him close to the only person alive who could carry that particular experiment to 11,000 feet. The problem was 800 pounds of scientific equipment and a research window measured in weeks. The solution was aviation, and it had never been done. On April 25, 1932, the bush pilot Joe Crossan put a ski-equipped Fairchild monoplane down on the Muldrow Glacier at just over 6,000 feet. Sources differ slightly on the exact elevation, and made the first glacier landing in the world. Crossan later described the site with the flatness of a working pilot. Perhaps a mile wide, a high ridge on one side and a low one on the other. About the best they had hoped for. Then he found out what the mountain does to airplanes. Trying to leave, wind pushed him back down repeatedly. He got the aircraft to 300 feet once before a downdraft put him back on the ice. Rather than keep gambling, Crossan shut it down, strapped on snowshoes, walked back to camp, and flew out the following morning. There was the warning, delivered on the first day and impossible to misread. The machine could reach the glacier, and the glacier could refuse to let the machine leave. Nobody read it that way. What everyone read was the arithmetic. 2 flights had just replaced weeks of relaying loads across Mosquito Country. By May 2nd, Carpe and Theodore Coven had a camp at the head of the Muldrow around 11,000 feet, and cosmic ray observations were running. On May 3rd, more of the team arrived on the lower glacier and supplies were dropped from a plane directly to the high camp. Then the party came apart, not dramatically, but in the ordinary way that expeditions come apart. Edward Beckwith fell ill around May 6th and stayed low. Nicholas Spadavecchia set out to find an aircraft. Percy Olton stayed with the sick man. None of those decisions was reckless. Each one was defensible on its own. Their combined effect was that on May 9th, on a heavily crevassed glacier at 11,000 feet, the 2 men at the high camp were alone. The record does not establish exactly what happened next, and honest accounts of it say so. Carpe went into a crevasse. Coven, by the evidence at the scene, went in trying to help, got himself out, and then died in the open. He was found about 100 yards from the crack. Understand what killing him took. Getting out of a crevasse, unassisted, at altitude after a fall, is a physical output most people cannot produce at sea level. It burns whatever reserve hypoxia has not already taken. It leaves a person soaked or bleeding or both, in air that is well below zero, wearing 1932 wool, with the nearest other human being days away by foot, and dependent on an airplane that could not reliably take off. He escaped the hole. He could not escape the sequence the hole started. On May 12th, a summit party led by Alfred Lindley and Harry Leake came down the same route and found Coven's body, roughly a mile and a half below the high camp. They also found the crevasse. They chose not to go to the edge and look in their own words, on account of the risk involved. They wrapped the body in a small tent and marked the spot by standing a sledge upright in the snow, so that whoever came back could find it. When a party did try to recover it, one of them, Pearson, dropped 40 feet into a crevasse, and the attempt was abandoned. Coven was not brought out until late August by Merle Lavoie and a companion. 4 days of digging produced no trace of Alan Carpe. He is still there. The science, for what it is worth, worked. Compton reported that Carpe's brief record was the only high-altitude cosmic ray value available at latitudes that far north. So the ledger from 1932 reads like this: Aviation delivered 2 men to a research altitude in hours, and then could not retrieve either of them. The airplane had compressed the approach without touching the rescue, and instead of being treated as a caution, the glacier landing became the standard tool. Because it worked, because it was cheap, and because the next question was obvious. If a pilot can put a scientist on the Muldrow at 6,000 feet, how much higher can a pilot go? The answer arrived in 1951, and it rewired the mountain permanently. Bradford Washburn, cartographer, photographer, the man who mapped Denali in obsessive detail, went at it from the west with Jim Gale and Bill Hackett and made the first ascent of the West Buttress. The route was chosen partly because the aerial photographs said it would work. The expedition hinged on the aircraft. Terrace Moore, who had invented a wheel ski system, letting a pilot take off on wheels and lower skis into position while airborne, landed them on the Kahiltna Glacier and erased the entire lowland approach in a single flight. That route is now the mountain. Well over 90% of Denali climbers use it. They fly from Talkeetna to a base camp at 7,200 feet on the southeast fork of the Kahiltna in well under an hour, step out of an aircraft, and start climbing roughly 13,000 vertical feet. Look closely at what that convenience did, because it is the hinge of this entire story. The 1913 party spent weeks below 10,000 feet before they ever got high, hauling loads, generating red blood cells they did not know they were generating. A modern climber goes from a Talkeetna airstrip at a few hundred feet of elevation to 7,200 feet in 40 minutes. Every foot of acclimatization now has to be manufactured on purpose, on a route where the temptation to move fast is enormous, at a mountain whose effective altitude is already thousands of feet above its printed one. The safest route on Denali created the modern problem: rapid arrival, no built-in adaptation, and a large population of moderately experienced climbers standing at a physiological 23,000 feet with a weather system overhead that answers to the Bering Sea. And it fills up. In 1992, 1,081 climbers from 291 expeditions and 23 countries came for it. 831 of them, 73%, went up the West Buttress, 48% summited. In 2024, 974 registered climbers produced 511 summits. Those numbers describe something the 1913 party would not have recognized: a queue. Before the queue, though, the mountain proved something on the old route that no amount of aviation has ever fixed. In the summer of 1967, Joe Wilcox, a 24-year-old graduate student, organized an expedition up the Muldrow, the Northern Walk-In Line, the 1913 route. The Park Service required his group to merge with a smaller, more experienced Colorado party led by Howard Snyder, and required radios, and required that the inexperienced climb under supervision. 12 men started up on June 22nd. By July 13th, they had a camp at 15,000 feet. By July 14th, a high camp at 18,000, delayed by a tent fire, and finished by 7 in the evening. On July 15th, 4 of them, Wilcox, Snyder, Jerry Lewis, and Paul Schlichter, stood on the summit at 6:30 in the evening in conditions that were close to perfect. Exceptional visibility, low wind, about 6 degrees above zero. Hold on to that afternoon, because it explains everything that follows. 8 men had not yet submitted. The weather had just demonstrated that the summit was easy. They had food, they had a high camp, and they had a radio. The warning is where the accounts split, and there is no honest way to smooth it over. Some reports indicate rangers passed on word of storms arriving around July 16th or 17th. Wilcox maintained that no advance notice reached him with any force, that what he got was vague, and said nothing about what was coming. What is not disputed is what the mountain did next. On July 16th, all 12 stayed put while 70 mph winds worked the high camp. One summit day burned to wind with a group already split between the men who had stood on top and the men still waiting their turn. On July 17th, 7 men went for the top. Jerry Clark, Steve Taylor, Walt Taylor, Dennis Luchterhand, Mark McLaughlin, Hank Janes, and John Russell. Wilcox's group started down at 1 in the afternoon. Clark's group left after 2, which was late, and which nobody at the time treated as fatal. At 8 that evening, Clark radioed that they were bivouacking in dense fog. The storm was on them. At 11:30 the following morning came the last transmission anyone ever received from that group. 5 of them had reached the summit. Russell had not. They intended to start down within 5 or 10 minutes. Nothing after that is on the record from their side. The National Weather Service and NOAA later reconstructed the system and did not soften it. The models put gusts high on the peak past 100 mph, escalating far beyond that, with air temperature somewhere between 15 and 30 below. Meteorologists described it as a once-in-a-century event. Wilcox concluded it was the worst weather any mountaineers had ever been documented inside. 5 men were still alive lower down at 15,000 feet, and their week is the part of this story people skip. They lost a tent and crowded into a 3-person shelter. Cooking became impossible, so they ate only what could be eaten cold, for days in the cold, at 15,000 feet. Which is the same as saying they stopped replacing the calories the altitude was burning. Lewis and Anchel Schiff weakened badly. Wilcox and Snyder lost feeling in their hands and feet. There was no rescue coming, because no rescue could exist inside that wind. On July 23rd, the weather relented enough for the 5 to move, and members of the Mountaineering Club of Alaska helped them down to 12,100 feet. On July 25th, they reached base camp. A helicopter came then, when a helicopter could finally fly. Searchers went up. On July 28th, they found 1 body, too decomposed to identify with confidence. Later analysis suggests either Steve Taylor or John Russell. On July 29th, they found 2 more, upright, frozen, near Archdeacon's Tower, probably Luchterhand and Walt Taylor, never positively identified. 4 men were never found at all. An expedition returned in 1968 specifically to look and found nothing. The bodies located the previous year had themselves disappeared into the mountain. 7 dead. It remains the deadliest accident in Denali's history, and it happened on the route the 1913 party walked, to a party that had radios. Bradford Washburn called it American mountaineering's worst disaster and attributed it to a combination of appalling weather and poor tactical decisions. Howard Snyder and Paul Schlichter later concluded that the group that died had wasted the good days and pressed on into deteriorating conditions. Wilcox spent decades arguing that the storm was outside anything human decision-making could have absorbed, and the weather studies gave that argument real support. 3 books make 3 cases. Snyder's account from 1973, Wilcox from 1981, and Andy Hall's later reconstruction built partly on Park Service logs and interviews with both men. There is no version of 1967 in which everyone is wrong, and none in which anyone is entirely right. But strip the blame argument out and one hard fact remains. Information reached that mountain in 1967. Help could not. The radio worked. The weather closed the sky, and a closed sky means the rescue simply does not exist, no matter who knows what, which sets the obvious modern expectation. Fix the forecasting and fix the aircraft, and you fix this. 22 years later, in the dead of winter, the mountain answered that expectation in a way nobody wanted. On February 20th, 1989, 3 Japanese mountaineers on the west buttress reached high camp at about 17,200 feet. The team was led by Noboru Yamada, who was not a novice by any measure, one of the most accomplished high-altitude climbers of that generation. On February 22nd, The weather opened briefly. Another team took the gap and started down. The Japanese party stayed in camp. The weather shut again almost immediately, and they were never heard from or seen alive again. Search flights spotted the bodies on March 10th below Denali Pass. Later that month, a 17-person team from the Japanese Alpine Club went up and brought them out. Cause of death: hypothermia. What happened afterward is one of the few genuinely constructive things in this history. A group from the Japanese Alpine Club, led by Yoshimoto Okura, argued that what killed Yamada's party was not inexperience, but wind speeds nobody had measured. So they went back up and installed an automatic weather station at Denali Pass, 5,715 meters. A memorial that produced data. It ran intermittently from 1990 to 2007, later operated by the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it recorded air temperatures down to roughly 60 below 0 Celsius and wind speeds in excess of 60 meters per second. Convert that second number into something a body understands: over 130 mph at 18,700 feet, in air cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute. Notice the sequence because it repeats here like a metronome. The instrument arrives after the deaths. The 1913 thermometer told us how cold Parker Pass gets, 19 years late. The 1989 station measured the wind at Denali Pass only after the wind had finished. By 1992, the forecasting had genuinely improved, and the mountain used it against everybody. In early May, the National Weather Service predicted, accurately, the worst storm to hit the mountain in 10 years. That is not a near miss or a hedge. That is a correct forecast issued in advance, with the severity stated plainly. What arrived matched it. More than 60 inches of snow at the 7,200-foot base camp in 24 hours, and winds over 110 meters at the 14,000-foot camp. 60 inches in a day at base camp is not a snowfall statistic. It is the airstrip gone. It is aircraft grounded, resupply stopped, and the exit that every climber on the west buttress is quietly counting on simply switched off. Winds over 110 mph at 14,000 feet mean tents destroyed, movement impossible, and any team above that point locked in place with whatever fuel they carried in. Everyone knew it was coming. Knowing did not move anyone off the mountain, because getting off the mountain required the same weather window the storm was occupying. In the 10 days that followed, 7 people died and 6 were rescued. By the end of the season, 11 had died on Denali, the worst year on record, in what became the deadliest climbing season the Alaska Range had known. The causes were not one thing, which is exactly the point. Alex von Bergen died at 14,200 feet of pulmonary and cerebral edema, the altitude killing him where the storm pinned him. Roberto Piombe and Giovanni Calcagno died on the south side. Calcagno's body never recovered. Song Seong-woo died in a 1,000-foot fall on the south face. 4 Canadian climbers, Alain Proulx, Christian Proulx, Alain Pauvin, and Maurice Grandchamp, fell roughly 3,000 feet in the Messner Couloir. Terence Stump, who went by Muggs and was one of the finest alpinists in the country, died in a crevasse on the south buttress. And here is where the modern machinery finally shows both its power and its ceiling. Rangers ran 22 rescue and recovery missions involving 28 climbers that season out of a permanent station at 14,200 feet, ferrying between that camp and Talkeetna in the middle of the crisis. For the second year, an Aerospatiale Llama helicopter was on contract, flown by Bill Ramsey, and it did something that had no precedent. It pulled 3 Korean climbers off the Kasson Ridge at 17,700 feet. Short-haul extraction, dangling a rescuer and a patient beneath the aircraft on a line, because there is nowhere to land, was used on Denali for the first time that year, taking 2 climbers off the east buttress at 11,000 feet. The Park Service spent $206,000 on rescue, double the previous year. Military costs came to another $225,345. That is a rescue system that works. Every component of it requires the storm to stop first, because a helicopter is not a solution to weather. It is a machine with a service ceiling, a load limit, and a pilot who has to see. Thin air at altitude cuts rotor performance exactly where the patients are. On Denali, the park's high-altitude A-Star B3 has been grounded below 14,200 feet by gusts around 70 mph, meaning the aircraft was flyable, the crew was ready, and the mountain still said no. When it can fly, it does extraordinary things. The highest short-haul rescue in park history was performed at 19,833 feet. And in 2024, a body was recovered from 19,600 feet on a long line. In that same 2024 season, a team at the 14,200-foot camp was treated for altitude-driven lung fluid and cold injuries. One climber with grade 4 frostbite to the nose and all 10 toes, and the weather held them there, treated but unflyable, for 2 days. So follow a rescue from the beginning, because this is where most accounts cheat. Somebody has to notice, which is not automatic on a mountain where teams are strung out over 13,000 vertical feet in cloud. The report has to reach Talkeetna, roughly 60 miles away, or the Rangers at 14,200. Somebody has to decide whether putting rescuers into that air is defensible. Crews have to be assembled and briefed, then fly there, which requires visibility they may not have, then find the people, which on a glacier in flat light is genuinely hard, then get close enough with no landing zone and no stable snow. Then the transfer for a hypothermic climber with a head injury on a 45-degree slope, the most dangerous part of the operation. Then the flight out. Every step has a weather gate on it, and the gates are in series, not parallel. One closes and the chain stops. Which brings us to the thing that ought to be reassuring and is not. If storms are the main killer on Denali, then storms are at least predictable, and prediction is improving. Storms are not the main killer. Late May 2011, a guided team from Alpine Ascents International, 4 people on one rope, is descending from Denali Pass to high camp at 17,200 feet. The conditions are clear and calm, not a storm. Not a whiteout. A good day. The stretch they are on has a nickname. Climbers call it the Autobahn, after a fatal slide by a German party, and the name is a description of physics rather than a joke. It is a traverse of about 45 degrees running below the pass, and it is hard. Not soft snow. Wind-scoured, wind-polished, hammered by the air that funnels through the coal, until the surface is closer to ice than snow. That is the mechanism nobody outside the sport thinks about. A pass is a low point in a ridge, et is a low balls, so the wind accelerates through it. An accelerating wind removes the loose snow and leaves the dense surface behind. The very geometry that makes the pass, the natural route, makes it the least forgiving ground on the mountain. Rangers place snow pickets along it as anchors precisely because of this, and climbers are meant to clip the rope through them as they pass. The 2011 season had already shown what the traverse does. On May 16th, Luciano Colombo, 67 years old, of Italy, fell about 1,000 feet from Denali Pass on a 45-degree slope of hard, wind-blown snow and died of the injuries. Climbers that year were reporting the surface as unusually difficult. Very little new snow, an icy and scoured trail. So on May 25th, the guide, Suzanne Allen, 34, of Seattle, starts the descent positioned last on the rope. That is the standard place for the strongest person during a descent, holding the team from above. Allen had summited Denali 3 times as a guide and had worked for Alpine Ascents for years. The company's director of programs described her afterward as a stellar guide from day one, someone who taught constantly. Nothing about this is a story of somebody who did not know the ground. Then Alan notices something small, specific, and professional. The person in front is not clipping the rope into the fixed pickets. She does the correct thing. She reverses the team's order and takes the lead herself, so that the protection gets clipped by the one person who will not forget to do it. That decision was right. It also cost her the position at the back of the rope. Two complications closed in. The route was confused between an old trail and a newer one. A detail that sounds trivial until you understand it means the pickets are not where your feet want to go, and the carabiners at the fixed pickets were missing, possibly stripped by other teams earlier that day. So at the moment the team transitioned onto the face, there was nothing on the rope. One climber slipped on a 45-degree wind-polished surface at nearly 18,000 feet at the end of a summit day. That slip pulled the others off their stances, and the second fall took the whole rope. 4 people went down over 1,000 vertical feet on terrain averaging more than 40 degrees. Nobody saw it happen. Shortly after 11 at night, a Park Service ranger patrol at the 17,200-foot camp spotted the team roughly 1,000 feet below the trail and immediately heard a shout for help. 14 experienced rescuers mobilized within hours. Air National Guard para-rescue men worked the patients on the slope. At 4:15 the following morning, the park's high-altitude A-Star B-3 flew to the 17,200-foot camp and took each patient out to Kahiltna Base Camp for onward transport. Suzanne Allen and the client Peter Bullard, 45, of Shanghai, were dead. James Moore, 30, was critically injured with head trauma and labored breathing. Gary Burke, 31, had a fractured leg and a head injury. Allen was the first guide killed on Denali in more than a decade. The American Alpine Club's accident analysis identified the core cause without softening it: travel on steep terrain without adequate protection, with the missing carabiners, and route confusion as contributing factors. Reported ages vary slightly between the Park Service release and the club's report. Now put that beside the numbers, because this is where everything you have assumed so far comes apart. Of the 96 people who died on Denali between 1903 and the end of the 2006 season, 61% died on the descent. 51% died on the west buttress, the easy route, the standard route, the one chosen because the aerial photographs said it was reasonable. 45% died from falls. The overall fatality rate works out to about 3 deaths per 1,000 summit attempts. Denali does most of its killing on good days, on the least technical line, going downhill. And the reason is the pressure trick from the very beginning, finally cashing out. A climber descending from the summit has been above 17,000 feet for hours in air that behaves like 23,000. Coordination is degraded. Reaction time is degraded. Judgment about whether to clip a picket is degraded. At the exact moment the ground turns to polished ice, on the last obstacle before camp with the tents visible below. The mountain does not need a storm for this. It needs a tired person on hard snow at an altitude that is lying about itself. For what it is worth, the record also shows something that worked. Fatalities dropped by 53% after the Park Service established a registration system in 1995, requiring people to check in, show a plan, and get briefed measurably saved lives. It did not touch the Autobahn. While the pass went on doing its work on the south side, the north side of the mountain did something nobody had planned for. It deleted its own history. On March 4, 2021, Chris Palm, a pilot for K2 Aviation, was flying the north side and saw something wrong with the Muldrow Glacier. The Muldrow is normally smooth and slow. The ramp the 1913 party walked, the ice Joe Crossan landed on in 1932, the route the Wilcox expedition took in 1967. From the air it was fractured end to end, crevassed along nearly its entire length. The glacier was surging. Ice that normally creeps was moving 10 to 20 meters a day, roughly 100 times its usual pace, and between May 1st and May 8th, it hit around 25 meters a day. It had started the previous winter and ran until late July 2021. The last time the Muldrow did this was 1956 and 1957, 64 years earlier. A surging glacier is not a slow-motion event to a climber. It is a route rewriting itself faster than anyone can map it. The access through McGonigal Pass got harder. The lower icefall became complex terrain full of unstable seracs, and the moraine bypass climbers used to avoid it became impassable. The section known as the Hill of Cracks turned into a maze that gets worse later in the season as snow cover thins. The Park Service assessment was that climbing the Muldrow in that state would be a formidable challenge with little guarantee of success, and warned about outburst flooding risk down the McKinley River. No team has completed the Muldrow since the surge. There is precedent for how long that lasts. After the 1956 surge, the northern route was not completed again until 1962. When Howard Cantner's party finally got through. 6 years. And here is where you should resist the easy conclusion, because the Park Service does. Officials stated that the Muldrow surge was likely not driven by climate change, but by the glacier's own structure, cycles of ice accumulation, and the behavior of meltwater at the bed. Only about 1% of the world's glaciers surge at all, and the Denali region happens to contain an unusually high proportion of them. Separately, and this is a different fact that must not be blended into the first one, ice cover across the park has declined 8% since 1952. Both things are true. Only one of them closed the route. A mountain can change for reasons that have nothing to do with the story we arrived expecting to tell. So where does a mountain kill next, once one of its roots has erased itself? Nowhere new. It goes on killing in exactly the place it always did. Nothing has touched the Autobahn. In the last days of May 2026, a 7-person Latvian expedition was near Denali Pass at about 18,200 feet when 4 of them fell. One, Martin Spilzens, was pulled off the mountain by helicopter long line the next afternoon, critically injured because there was nowhere to land. Ines Pucheka, Vija Olte, and Renars Koenig Salax died. Their teammates who worked the rescue deteriorated physically doing it and had to be flown out themselves the following day. The bodies were not recovered until June 3rd. Park Service statements about that stretch of ground are blunt. Most of the deaths along the pass have happened while climbers were descending, and the Autobahn has produced more fatalities than anywhere else on the mountain. That same season showed the other half of the system. On May 31st, Logan McKenna, 44, a surgeon from Utah, summited and then had a medical emergency just after midnight at around 18,600 feet on the way down. The body was recovered on June 3rd. On June 4th, a climbing ranger named Robin Pendery fell into a crevasse on patrol near the 14,000-foot camp and died. The first Denali climbing ranger killed on the mountain in more than 25 years, since Cale Schaffer in 2000. Pendery had spent 12 years as an emergency room nurse and worked as a mountain guide before joining the ranger staff, which is to say the person best positioned to survive Denali died of the same mechanism that killed the first man ever to die there, 94 years earlier, on a different glacier, on the other side of the peak. The crowding is documented too, and it is the 1951 decision still working. On May 28, 2026, there were 516 people on the mountain. Bad weather through late May and early June compressed everybody's plans into the same narrow summit windows, which put large numbers of tired climbers onto the same hard ground at the same hour. Between May 26 and mid-June, Rangers ran 17 search and rescue incidents producing 23 evacuations, 5 of them body recoveries. So look at the whole machine at once. The geography sets the constraint, a wall of rock at 63 degrees north with a shorter atmosphere above it and nothing upwind to blunt what the ocean sends. The cold tightens that constraint further, pulling the effective altitude thousands of feet above the number on the map. Weather activates it, arriving off the Bering Sea and the Gulf with the jet stream sometimes lying directly across the summit. Human motive supplies the exposure. Cosmic ray data in 1932, a graduate student's expedition in 1967, guided clients now, all inside a season a few weeks long. Technology changes the shape of the exposure without reducing it. The glacier landing removed the walk-in and with it, the acclimatization. The west buttress removed the difficulty and added the crowd. Forecasting removed the surprise and left the trap. The helicopter removed the distance on the days the weather permits it and on no other days. Distance and altitude limit rescue in series, so every gate has to open at once. And the history repeats, not because people keep making the same mistake, but because the system keeps offering the same reasonable-looking decision, which is why the deaths cluster where they do. Not on the hardest ground, but on the standard route. Not in the storm, but on the clear afternoon. Not going up, but coming down. The one thing that has genuinely changed is the timing. Nobody now dies waiting 19 years for a thermometer to be read. The forecast arrives, the station records the wind, the Ranger Patrol is at 14,200, the helicopter is on contract, and the accident report gets published. The mountain simply operates inside all of it. Climbers still register in Talkeetna before they fly. The building where they sign in is called the Walter Harper Talkeetna Ranger Station, named for the 21-year-old Koyukon Athabaskan, who walked to that summit first before anyone had heard of a glacier landing and got everybody down. They finish the paperwork, weigh their gear, and take the flight in. On any clear morning in May, you can watch the end of it from the Kahiltna at 7,200 feet. A ski plane running up the glacier, lifting off, banking away empty toward Talkeetna to go get the next load. Behind it, a rope team is already walking uphill into thinner air than the map admits. The flight takes less than an hour. It is the same trip, on the same kind of aircraft, on the same schedule, that put the first bodies on this mountain in 1932, and it has never once had trouble filling a seat.